Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum's annual celebration of Bloomsday. We're doing things a little bit differently this year to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of the book by an American publisher, Sylvia Beach. And this year we're delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Anne Fogarty, who's the Professor of James Joyce Studies at University College Dublin and one of the world's experts on all things Joyce. And she'll be joined with our own Dr. Margaret Lasch Carroll, who is not only a trustee of the museum, but is also a lecturer of literature at the Albany College of Pharmacy. So Meg has been, or Dr. Carroll has been leading a book club since September. And they've been taking a chapter at a time and reading Ulysses. So they're absolutely thrilled to talk about this book, which is, of course, deeply embedded, in Irish intellectual discourse and internationally significant. So I'm going to turn it over to our experts, and then at the end, anyone who's on the webinar, you can use the Q&A feature down here to type your questions, and we'll get into that. So I'll just mute myself and take it away, doctors. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anne. I want to thank you again for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
And I know Ulysses is on every best of list that appears. So I guess a place to start maybe is, why is Ulysses a great novel?
In some ways, because it is so big, and also because it deals with the everyday. It's famously a one-day novel set on 16th of June, 1904. And by and large, Joyce chose that day because it was the first kind of full-blown date on which he went with Nora Barnacle in Dublin. And she, of course, was to be his lifelong consort. So Ulysses is unusual in that it's this gigantic novel, a big, long novel that deals with a lot of big themes, but concentrates on the miniature. And you could almost say almost nothing happens in the novel, or maybe to formulate it differently, very little happens and a lot happens at the same time, everything and nothing. So Joyce, in a way, is kind of summing up the paradox of existence. He's putting his native city, Dublin, on the map. That certainly was one of the grand aims in writing an epic novel about a city that was still a colonial city in the period, ruled from Westminster. And he saw it as quite a demoralized city. Your readers, I'm sure, will be familiar with Dubliners as well, which is much darker in tone than Ulysses in terms of the way it represents Dublin. I don't think you could say that Ulysses is totally upbeat about Dublin, but you get a sense of a much more energized, vast city in Ulysses compared to the Dublin of Dubliners. So something different is happening in this novel, and Joyce is capturing the energy, the modernity of Dublin, as well as all its problems. And absolutely, he's capturing the full cast of characters, everything that he can cram in about Dublin into this one-day novel.
Just as, what would you say is one of the big themes? And then also, what are a couple of the miniature things?
Yeah, those are good questions. I think everybody probably would answer those questions. Everyone who has read Ulysses might answer those questions in different ways. I'm very interested in the historical and political dimensions of Ulysses and the fact that it is a radical novel. Its dates coincide partly with the First World War, but it's published in 1922, which, as everyone Irish and in Ireland will know, is the year in which the Irish Free State gets established as well. So there's some kind of uncanny coincidence that Joyce's great novel, which is about the liberation of the Irish people, getting them to think for themselves, be independent, free themselves, not just of British rule, but everything else that oppresses them. Stephen Dedalus in the first chapter says he's the servant of or three masters. The third one he doesn't name, so we're all still guessing what it might be. But the first master is certainly British imperialism, so imperial rule, and the second master is the Roman Catholic Church, being directed from Rome. And the third one may be nationalism. It might be Stephen's own vocation, his family legacy. We don't quite know. So Stephen, who's actually quite liberated, of course, compared to the other Irish people around him, still sees himself as triply oppressed in that novel. So it is a novel about finding one's way and somehow freeing oneself of various burdens in existence. Leopold Bloom, of course, the other hero of the novel, is differently burdened. He is a kind of outsider in Irish society. So those are some of the big themes: freedom, liberation, and then art itself. This is a novel that's one of the great artistic artworks, one of the great artworks of the 20th century. It's designed to revolutionize the novel, turn it upside down and inside out, in a way, to write a novel that departs from any kind of convention that a novel could or should use. And so Joyce is forcing us to think about art, immersing us in this great artwork. So those are some of the big themes that I would nominate. The other themes often happen on an absolute micro level, just the level of a word. Say even the yes with which Ulysses ends, what that word might mean, whether it is that kind of grand declaration, optimistic opening out that we sometimes read it as. It stitches together Penelope anyway. It's a repeated word. Penelope, as everybody will know, is not punctuated. There are more or less 8 sentences, but they don't have commas or anything like that that'll help us to navigate our way. But the yes that Molly uses has different meanings all the way through. But she ends seemingly with a kind of affirmation. She's remembering her love tryst with Leopold Bloom on the beautiful hill of Howth, which is the north of Dublin Bay, a beautiful promontory. And it's also when Molly and Leopold have a sexual encounter on the day that they recall, but also Bloom proposes to Molly, or in fact, it seems they mutually propose to each other. It's very reciprocal, and a kind of marriage based on two people really coming together and her leading the way. In fact, she prompts Bloom to ask her with her eyes. And Molly is replaying that moment out of nostalgia, maybe, out of slightly a sense of loss and wistfulness, but she turns it towards the future because she says, I will, yes, at the end. An original version of Penelope had I would, yes, the conditional tense, and it seems like a small change, but it's actually quite a consequential one, because by changing from I would, which in some ways to me sounds maybe a little bit more Irish. I think an Irish person might say would instead of will sometimes anyway. But she says, and yes, I said, I will, yes. And so we end like that. So it seems like as if Joyce is retrieving something there through Molly. And she is an explosion of language anyway, an unseen figure who comes to us at the end. But there, you could say all of the minor characters in Ulysses are part of the details as well. The characters who crop up only once or crop up more often than that, but always in just, tiny little walk-on parts. But they are all significant. And Joyceans, of course, delve down into all of them. And very many more of them have been found to have had a real life counterpart than people imagined anyway. So he's bringing the fictional and the real together all the time. And then almost any allusion that we come across on Joyce forces us to think on the level of the word. It's a great grand sweep of a novel. It's kind of fatal to read it too slowly, or you'll never get to the end. But at the same time, Joyce forces us to pay attention to words. So you can really stop start all the time, and you can dip into it and just home in on a short passage.
We had a lot of fun following words like UP up, or the man in the Macintosh, or the Rosa Bean,
Yes.
watching those
Yeah.
reappear.
Yes.
Elijah is
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah. One of the early scholars, a great American scholar of modernism and of Joyce, Hugh Kenner, in his book about Ulysses, he talks about the aesthetics of delay in Ulysses, that things accumulate and
Mm,
a lot of the information in the novel only comes together at the very end, partly because we have the huge Ithaca episode, the
mhm.
catechism episode, where there's a lot of Q&A, questions and replies, catechism style, and a
Well, the
lot of
listing.
information
Yeah.
is packed in there about the weight and height of Leopold Bloom, what's on his bookshelves, all
Yeah.
kinds of other information is given to us. But it's also a thing that Joyce does. He patterns. So you're absolutely right. A motif will get repeated, like in music, actually. And you have to kind of let things stay in your mind and linger there and begin to knit them up then as you go through. And you won't do all that in the first reading. You know, when you
Yeah.
go back at a second reading, you suddenly see things.
And actually the beauty for us being, novices, the beauty of having a group is different people notice different things. And then when we come together, we can kind of collect our observations. That alone, do you need a drink of water?
I have water. Excuse me.
That's okay.
Yes, no, I completely agree. And some people actually say that's the ideal setting in which to read Ulysses is within a group, because you feel you need to be able to kind of think prismatically. So you need this kind of collective mind, and also people that know different things about different aspects of the world, or even who are interested in different things. So it'll force you to kind of linger on something that you might be ready to skip over. You know, say somebody who knows an awful lot about farming, agriculture and cattle and things like that. That person will linger over the cattle on the streets of Dublin and think about foot and mouth disease and all of the other
Yeah.
kinds of references that are there
Yeah.
in Ulysses. And that's just one of literally thousands would be to kind of underestimate it. I think tens of thousands of references.
Maybe we could focus a little bit on Homer. I mean, the novel is Ulysses after Odysseus. And you gave us a great look at the big themes and the big picture. And certainly the parallel to the Odyssey is part of this, the homecoming. Maybe, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, there's lots to say. In some ways, Joyce wanted Homer to kind of fade into the narrative. When Ulysses was being serialized in the States in the Little Review, it still had the Homeric titles, the chapter episode titles that we still use. But Joyce then removed them from the final printed text because he felt it kind of overemphasized the scaffolding. But I think it's crucial for readers. It really is genuinely helpful. And also it establishes so many of the themes of the novel, as you say, because you have the wanderings of both Telemachus, the son, whom we meet first, and then Bloom Odysseus, who's a form of Odysseus. Odysseus has fought the war in Troy. The Greeks have won it. He's due to go home, but he does so by a long delayed circumnavigation, and he undergoes all kinds of adventures as well. And then eventually the final section of the Odyssey is the Nostos, the last 3 episodes of Ulysses, the homecoming. So I think it's essential to have that kind of map in your head. And Joyce intended it as a kind of opening out of Ireland to the world as well. Ireland, that's kind of a backwater, a society that has stagnated since particularly the cataclysms of the 19th century, the famine in the mid-19th century, and then the fall of Parnell, the loss of a great nationalist leader. And he kind of maps Dublin onto the Mediterranean so that you're looking out at the world. Ireland on the western verge of Europe is looking eastwards, and then beyond the Mediterranean to other easterly domains as well. So it's a kind of cosmic remapping of things that he's undertaking. And then the events of the Odyssey simply reverberate through all of the episodes in lots of different ways. And it's not just parody. Sometimes people see it as one way, that you have this grand epic and people in Dublin in 1904 who are being wrongly aggrandized and scaled up to epic dimensions that they can't possibly reach. But that's not what Joyce really intended at all. It's a two-way process. The two texts read each other all the way through. And of course, he is rewriting Homer, even as he's using Homer. He's updating Homer, modernizing him, particularly in terms of Penelope, I think, but also Odysseus. And he liked Odysseus because the Odyssey is a post-war novel. Joyce is a pacifist. Odysseus has been a fighter, but he's a different kind of character in the Odyssey compared to the Iliad, which is totally about the war in Troy. So the Odyssey is about an aftermath, and Odysseus turning homeward, thinking about all kinds of personal relations and other facets of things. So Joyce likes this kind of figure.
Because really, yeah, Odysseus he's learned to become a man of peace as he makes his way home after the war. So thinking of, so we had great discussions actually finding those parallels and looking at them seriously, not finding Joyce parodying, the Dublin, but finding true serious reflections on what is heroic in our age. What anxieties do we have? So, circling back to Bloom a little bit, if you spoke beautifully about how Ulysses is a great novel, why is Leopold Bloom one of the most memorable characters, you could say, of the 20th century, I might say ever?
And it's not exaggerated to say so. I think he is one of the most beloved characters in 20th century fiction. It's almost a test of personality. I mean, if you come across somebody who says they don't like Bloom, then there's something wrong. And people may take issue with one or two aspects of Bloom, but not the character or the figure overall. He's very endearing. Obviously, he's invented as kind of everyman, an outsider, a kind of conundrum. He's an insider outsider because he's Jewish but non-Jewish. He's not a practicing Jew. He's been baptized in a Protestant and a Catholic, so he belongs to. Yet he's secular, as we know as well. He's of every religion and none. He's very funny, very witty. He's curious and inquisitive, guarded certainly. You could say too, he has quite a dark side to him just because of his own personal family history that he is certainly very much chewing over in the course of the day. And I think that is something we relate to as well. Bloom is flawed. He is emotionally under pressure for the entire day because of Molly's pending affair, which has been building up anyway with Blazes Boylan, and he knows that this is the day on which they probably will sleep with each other. And that's almost always on his mind. You find when you begin to look at his thought processes, he keeps circling back to this. But also he's remembering the death of his father and the loss of their son, Rudy, at 11 days. So to use a phrase from our own era, there's so much unfinished business in the life of Leopold Bloom, but yet he seems to kind of cheerfully battle on, and he's rarely ungracious or antagonistic to other people, which just doesn't stop him being ironic and acerbic every now and again, particularly in his head. I think not directly to people. He does take people on in the pub in Cyclops, I think, but other than that, we have his just wonderful thought processes, which are completely human. But he defamiliarizes everything as well. I'm not a Dubliner. I'm from the south of Ireland, from Cork. But Bloom sees Irish society overall, despite having grown up in the city, very much from the outside. And he renders it quite funny as a result. And So sometimes he seems almost like a tourist has dropped into Dublin, but yet he belongs to the city. So he thinks things like, that a good puzzle would be to try and walk across Dublin without passing a pub, which in effect you could not do to this day. COVID has shut down a few more of the pubs, but still it would be very, very difficult to do. Yeah, and in the Nausicaa episode, he wonders, do fish get seasick? When he's thinking about the sea and things like that. And that's just one of some of the several kinds of questions that pop up in his head. And he wants to know everything as well. I think that's the other. He's quite a solitary figure. Strangely, like we get a sense that he's sociable. Not gregarious. He's quite alone, and he especially seems to come under attack when he goes indoors into public places where other people are congregated. The danger zones for him seem to be places like the pubs, the Davy Byrnes, and then Barney Kiernan's later in Cyclops. So the more he gets into contact with groups of men in particular, the more he runs into trouble. But he's hugely interested in other people nonetheless.
We found it interesting in our discussion of Bloom, and I do want to bring up the words mirroring Dublin and having aspirational ideas that you have used in a recent webinar. But he seems to have socialistic ideas. He's he's angry at the wealthy and the upper classes and the unfair distribution of food, and very sensitive to the poor. And that's a really interesting.
It's hard to construe his politics. He's partly a nationalist as well. We hear kind of through the rumor machine of the Dubliners talking to each other that he gave the idea of Sinn Féin, the party that now exists in another form, but was set up in Joyce's day by Arthur Griffith. But this came from Bloom. Yes, certainly. And then in the kind of nightmarish hallucinatory episode, Circe, that happens in Nighttown in Monto, there he transmogrifies into a Lord Mayor of Dublin. And all the way through, he seems to be intent on thinking up schemes for improving the well-being of people in Dublin. And yes, I mean, he worries about the blind stripling that he meets. He wonders, how does he see the world? That his sensations of the space around him must just operate differently. So yes, he's aware of the plights of others. He seems to have kind of infinite empathy for other people. It doesn't stop him sometimes thinking negatively or going every which way in thinking about women, for instance, again in the Nausicaa episode. But it is true that even though, and one of his tasks for the day is to help out Paddy Dignam's widow to sort out the botched insurance that her husband has kind of mortgaged on her, so where she may end up destitute. So it's kind of, he's motivated by a kind of act of charity for that particular day.
Yes. One of the things you spoke about, some of the way he can be critical. A couple times he comments on the stockings of AE's secretary. He doesn't like that they bunch around the ankles. So first of all, being that aware of his physical surroundings and of the dress of people, but also just having that kind of critical thought.
I think it captures some of the sexual fetishism of the period as well. Women's legs were not that visible, and Joyce himself was fascinated by women's nether parts and underpants and things like that. And Bloom shares some of those sexual peccadillos. So yes,
he's annoyed when he misses catching the view of the ankle when the woman step into the coach. Another tram goes by.
You can tell you're very much in the post-Victorian period in the Edwardian era when pornography in some ways still seems quite demure to us by modern standards.
So thinking of Stephen now, sort of in some ways on an opposite pole, but by the end of the novel, is Stephen an artist? Has he achieved that stature? You know, we meet him at the end of Portrait, poised, you know, to forge in the smithy of his soul. But does he achieve it in Ulysses, do you think?
Not yet. I think the whole principle is that the artist is a person in evolution. And Lenihan says about Bloom, there's a touch of the old artist about Bloom. So another factor in Ulysses anyway is that conjointly it's Bloom and Stephen together who constitute the artist. In Circe, they both look into a mirror and see the face of Shakespeare, who in a way is upstaging both of them once again. So showing that the artistic principle plays itself out in very complex ways. So Stephen always seems to be on the way to becoming an artist. He is one de facto, but hasn't produced the work. And people have even debated this. Could the Stephen we meet in Ulysses have written Ulysses? Or is the whole idea that, you know, he has failed, that he is never really going to get there, and that the artistry lies in some other area that he's not quite perceiving in the everyday world of Dublin, that the Stephen would have to move on in his thinking to produce the kind of work that Joyce himself ultimately produces.
I know one of the questions we talked about was at the end of Eumaeus. No, it's Ithaca. At the end of Ithaca, where Stephen leaves.
Yes.
Or that's not Ithaca, that's Eumaeus. Is it Eumaeus? Well, anyway, one of those chapters, he leaves.
Ithaca, yeah. Ithaca's further back in,
That's right, in the beginning of Ithaca. Where does he go? And
indeed,
he's going off to write Ulysses.
Yeah, that's a nice way of thinking of it. That's a good answer. Yeah, there's obviously people have speculated about this, potentially to stay with Aunt Sarah, you know, because he would end up a vagrant on the street. And of course, we don't know what kind of future the novel imagines for itself. Their gestures towards, we're brought in effect, to the 17th of June because it's the middle of the night. But we don't really know how things develop onwards. We can only speculate, but and that's how days work, you know, that it will continue in some ways. And there isn't the grand reconciliation between Bloom and Stephen that one thinks could come about, because it's not a great meeting of minds.
Although you wonder, do they, and again, this is Joyce's 20th century version of Homer. Both are changed by even that brief. It seems like that gives Bloom the courage to go up to the bedroom. And then Stephen has some sort of grounding to now go off, like one way anyway, to think about it.
And Bloom seems to have a kind of grand plan for Stephen, as does Molly. Molly kind of knows what has happened, so she muses about Stephen as well, that Bloom, in a way, wants Stephen to become a kind of future lover's son for Molly. But she thinks about him as this adopted friend, or not so much a lover, just somebody that Bloom has befriended. So he has this anomalous status. But yeah, it is true. And Stephen seems to be rude in singing an anti-Semitic ballad in the Ithaca episode, which brings us back to particularly the antagonism in the Cyclops scene in Bernie Kiernan's pub. And Bloom is certainly affronted, and he does feel insulted by the song, but then he rethinks his emotions as well. So you're right, there's some way in which Bloom changes there. And Bloom certainly has been ready all the way through, particularly in Oxen of the Sun, to embrace what Stephen might represent, however obstreperous he might be.
And I know the time is flying by, and I thank you again. I did want to ask you about music, and I didn't know if that would be too much of a digression, because I also want to ask about what brought you to Ulysses. So maybe we'll start with you. What brought you to Ulysses, and what keeps you coming back to it?
Being an undergraduate, I think my initial degree, I did a BA in arts. My subjects were English and German, and in my era, I was doing a degree in the 1970s. did not study fiction much at all. If you did a degree, you were primarily studying a lot of historical periods of English. But even so, it was almost always poetry. Prose or fiction didn't get a look in. So I didn't study Joyce at university. So he was extracurricular for me. He wasn't banned or anything. It was nothing to do with censorship. We just did not study fiction. I think we read one novel by Jane Austen. In fact, we didn't read women writers either. And there would have been, we studied Yeats for sure. We wouldn't probably not have studied all that many Irish writers either. Irish writing is a much bigger component of the university curriculum in Ireland. So because I was studying German, I used to spend my summers in Germany. So just setting myself tasks as one does after exams are over. I think the first summer, the summer after first year, as we call it in Ireland, I read Ulysses in Germany. So I kind of had to go to another country to discover Joyce.
Wow. And then what have you discovered in your multiple readings? Like I'm sure I've gone back to it many, many times. So what are some of the discoveries with rereadings?
In some ways, almost everything. Now I can't imagine what I was doing when I first read the novel. We've so many aids now. There's so much we can look up online, and there are the great annotated editions with hyperlinks that call up the songs and images for us. So, and now, of course, I have a big Joyce library myself. I just recently reviewed the new annotations that are going to replace the Gifford volume, which is way longer than Gifford and much more precise on all kinds of details and information. So you keep going back to really fill in the gaps. I guess you always feel not so much in deficit, but that there's more to know. So you circle back. And I think a lot of reading Joyce is about rereading him anyway. That even within a first careful reading, when you begin to study Joyce properly, I mean, I would have been reading through initially just to get from the first page to the very end. And it's good to ignore things as well. I don't think any individual can actually pay attention to absolutely everything going all the way through. I think you learn that very quickly as well, that if you slow read Joyce too slowly, that you'll take the pleasure out of the text, that you need to push forward and ignore some things, basically. You know they're a bit like a pebble in your shoe. They're irritating you because you don't quite know what they might mean. Or sometimes you just make an assumption and then much later you find out, oh, I was all wrong, and you have to change your thinking. So I think it is what Yeats calls the fascination of what's difficult in a way, but difficult is not unpleasurable. You go back to discover more and to add more to what you know about the text. And I'm in the lucky position of teaching Joyce. I mean, reading Joyce in a reading group was great, but the next best thing is to teach Joyce, because then you reread the episodes and do your preparation, and the students draw your attention to new things. So I guess it's kind of constant acts of discovery. You can't become complacent about Ulysses. You feel there's just always new things to see and to pick up on.
I know one of the members of our group went back to reread Calypso. And we haven't had our final meeting yet. We're going next week. We're discussing chapter 18, Penelope. So we're almost there. But he emailed me today saying he went back to reread Calypso and he couldn't get over all of the foreshadowing in Calypso. That of course, when you're going through it the first time, you don't know that until you go back and look. So endless fun. And, just keep circling. A couple of other topics before we run out of time. One is, you mentioned women, and of course Molly's our great woman character, but we have Gertie McDowell and other Josie Green are mentioned, and I read that especially early feminist criticism was kind of split about Joyce's treatment of women. One school saying Joyce was aligning himself with the patriarchy, and another group feeling Joyce was shedding light on the hypocrisy of the patriarchy. And, I'm thinking of our discussion of Gertie McDowell of Nausicaa. That is Joyce showing the limitations of information accessible to women, or is he kind of parodying, he's parodying popular women's literature, but is he showing women as limited, or what they're exposed to as limited? I guess, what do you think about that?
Yeah. And I think one has to give a kind of complicated answer to that. All of Joyce's female friends, including Nora Barnacle, were absolute feminists. Some of them wouldn't have used a word like that. I guess Nora wouldn't, but she was utterly independent-minded and a free spirit. And so Joyce was certainly attuned to feminism. I would include, Harriet Shaw Weaver, Sylvia Beach, Jane Heap, Margaret Anderson, all the great editors that he worked with, who also were friends of his and intellectual companions, particularly Harriet Shaw Weaver. With Nausicaa, at the present moment, is the episode that seems to fascinate people most. My students love it, but we also have these very long, intricate debates about it. And definitely Gertie MacDowell is being read differently now. She often was seen as just trivialized by Joyce, and a lot of the early male critics in particular kind of accepted that point of view, this namby-pamby style that he talks about. It's assumed that he's sort of belittling her, and like you just said, that she has fallen victim to consumerism, popular culture, women's magazines, fashion, and so on, and can't think except through this kind of trivial dimension. But Joyce also is trying out being a woman novelist in the Gertie episode and inhabiting her consciousness. So it's a big stylistic experiment for him. And Gertie is very knowing as well. I think earlier views of her assumed that, she is this virginal, innocent figure, dangling her legs on Sandyman Strand, but not going much further than that. Whereas now, it's recognized she's an adult and she knows what she's doing. She shares in the sexual encounter with Bloom, albeit, of course, it's unbalanced. But yet she is trapped. I mean, Joyce can't change the conditions that existed for women in Dublin in the period, and also he can't change that plot segment in the Odyssey either. Nausicaa sees Odysseus naked on the beach, and he kind of shamefacedly hides his genitals with a branch or something like that. In fact, Joyce's version is a little bit more decorous in some ways. I know Bloom masturbates as the climax of the scene, but they're fully dressed and so on. And Nausicaa is interested in Odysseus as a figure, but it goes nowhere. And of course, the same is true of Gertie MacDowell. And she trails out of the picture. It's an unfinished story in Ulysses. Again, going back to Hugh Kenner, one of the points he makes is that Dublin is as much about what it doesn't say Ulysses is as much about what it doesn't say as what it says. It's a big book, but there are a lot of silences and gaps as well. Yeah. And Gertie MacDowell's story is one instance for sure. We don't quite know what her future might be. And she's a wistful figure on that level. But Joyce gets her very precisely. So he's not looking down on her. She's very up to date and modern. So she's not just an Irish Colleen. She's reading the magazines that are fashionable in her era. She knows about fashion. She doesn't have the money to follow up on things. She buys things in the sales and Cleary's and so on, and gets her own outfits together. We also know she has a very hard home life. So you have those romantic facets to Gertie's imaginings, but they're laid over a very kind of harsh take on her existence. Her father is an alcoholic. Gertie herself doesn't really have a position in the world. She's kind of being forced into the role of mother. She's very vehemently anti-maternal. She says lots of, scathing things about the three little boys they're looking after on the beach. She's not at all into that. So yeah, we don't quite know where her story will go, but I think there's enough of a kind of energy and vibrance and independence in Gertie as a figure for us to see her as a modern young woman in Dublin, but in very difficult circumstances.
and takes advantage, I guess, of what's available to her.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I guess one more question. I think I can
Yeah.
get in. I think Elizabeth wants us to wrap it up. And Molly, I watched a St. Bridget's Day talk this year in 2022 that you were part of, and you said that Molly, and I'll quote you, outstrips and goes beyond the work of which it is a part. What do you mean by that? That Molly goes beyond the work?
Joyce, we know, had different things in mind for the ending. He thought originally that the Penelope episode might be an exchange of letters, but then he realized he wanted to counterbalance Stephen on Sandymount Strand. Stephen's which is more or less a monologue by Stephen and Proteus, with the female monologue. We already had a male monologue, and it should end then with the female monologue. But it's outside the scheme of the novel. We don't quite know the time. It's the middle of the night. We've never quite met her. She's there in Calypso, but she's eclipsed. She's gossiped about, talked about, thought about, of course, by Bloom all the way through the novel. One critic has argued that we just see bits of her. Her arm throws a coin out the window in Wandering Rocks, for instance. And you wonder, why doesn't she leave the house? Why is she always in the house for the duration of that day? But then Joyce invents this voice for her and this form for Penelope that seems to have overwhelmed the text at the end. You feel it grows beyond any kind of proportion or imagining. And he talks about it in terms of the body. That's how he's imagining Penelope, but he also talks about Penelope in cosmic planetary terms, kind of sense of us moving out into this wide field of gravity of the female, of Molly Bloom's mind at the end. And in some ways as well, I think Penelope is a kind of, it loosens everything in the text. Molly corrects a lot of things that have been said about her, so she's trying to, in a way, talk back at the novel and deny some of the rumors about her, all the lovers she supposedly had, and so on. Again, like Gertie MacDowell, she's not the typical Irish woman. She's not very maternal. Her thoughts gravitate in other directions, thinking about her career. Even she doesn't think that much about the death of Rudy. She does think about it in very pathetic terms, certainly. But she's not as taken up with that death, I think, as Bloom is. She's got many other things on her mind. And in effect, she's rewriting the novel. It's like she's pulling the novel out of Joyce's hands and rewriting it from a female point of view. So it's a wonderful, grandiose ending. Excuse me.
Oh, that's great. That's a great way for us to wrap up our talk. So Elizabeth, if you want to open up some other questions. See if Elizabeth is up.
I am. I just turned back on my video. So that was fantastic. I was listening to you.
Oh, it was. Thank you.
Yeah. So I texted all the panelists a minute ago, or the participants a minute ago, to ask if they have questions, that they should have written it into the Q&A, and they did not. So it looks like we don't have questions from them. But Mary Kramer had asked, was there a reason why Joyce did not follow am I saying this right, the pattern and the sequence of episodes from the Odysseus? Why did he not follow exactly the same pattern or sequence? If you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, there are lots of reasons. Again, everything in relation to Ulysses, there's always more than one answer, one point of view, and I think Joyce forces us to think things through in certain a lot of different directions, and there's no right or wrong answer. Some people argue that he was really influenced by Lamb's Tales. The first version of the Odyssey that he read was a 19th century retelling of the Odyssey, which took selected episodes, didn't re-narrate all of the Odyssey for children. and that Joyce is actually loyal to the episodes that come up in Lamb's version of the Odyssey. And Joyce loves beginnings. He's very loyal to where things begin, where things start out from. Absolutely fundamental things like his origin in Dublin and things like that. So I think that's one reason. He's always going to deviate anyway from the plot of the Odyssey, in that the Odyssey ends quite violently, that Odysseus slaughters the suitors. And as Margaret Ashwood pointed out, Margaret Ashwood rewrote the Penelope ending in calling it Penelopiad. She also notes that the handmaidens, Penelope's handmaidens, are all hung as well, because they're seen as being part of the treachery at the end of the text. And that violence does not occur in Ulysses. So he's cleaving to the Odyssey, but he's also reworking it and rewriting it.
Okay, that's fascinating. So Mary asked, do you have any suggestions as to the identification of the man in the Macintosh?
And we have a theory, Anne. So.
Okay, I'll be keen to hear. Again, there are many, many answers, lots of interesting ones. That he's God, that he's various figures like Mr. Duffy from Dubliners.
That's ours, Mr. Duffy.
That he's Joyce. He's a kind of ghost in the machine. James Clarence Mangan, the 19th century romantic Irish poet, also a Dubliner whom Joyce liked, had a pseudonym. He called himself the Man in the Cloak. So the man in the Mac in the Macintosh could be Mangan as well. So yeah, people have come up with all kinds of answers.
I think Mr. Duffy makes the most sense, though, because he's visiting the grave. Mrs. Sinico comes up.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's great to have one of those little puzzles, that you can debate about at cocktail parties for years,
Yes.
Kathy has asked, Kathy Burgess, would you please speak about the role of music in Ulysses? So I think Meg had asked and then we diverted.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. That's true. It's another one of those large scale questions. Several brilliant books have been written about music and Joyce. I mean, you could say that music is the essence of everything in Ulysses. It's essential to a reading of the novel. Joyce is particularly interested. Obviously, he was a singer himself, as was his father. They're both very, very gifted singers. His mother was a gifted musician as well, and there's music in various branches on the maternal side and paternal side of the family. Colm Tóibín has argued that music is a way in which a kind of fractured or divided society can really come together. Irish evenings tend to end in sing-songs. People sing in pubs. Music is essential to Irish culture. It was also part of the cultural revival in the period, a rediscovery of the importance of Irish music, instrumental music, as well as vocal music, Irish dance, and so on. And of course, there was another folk revival again from the 1960s onwards, Clancy Brothers and so on. It's like Irish people had to constantly be persuaded of the fact that traditional oral music is important. And Joyce brings all the musical traditions together, so he kind of clashes them off against each other. Say, like in Sirens, Leopold or Simon Dedalus is singing Ma Paris from Martha, an opera by Friedrich von Flotto. He's actually singing an English version of the aria. There's a nice coincidence in that it's Martha Clifford that Bloom is having the sexual correspondence with. And so I think Joyce enjoys that facet of things. But Joyce's father loved to sing operatic arias, and this was one of his favorites. It's a demanding aria to sing, but simultaneously Ben Dollard, or later in Sirens, Ben Dollard sings the very, very beautiful ballad, the Copy Boy, which is a very different kind of performance. And we're listening to the words, we're listening to the musicality, we're picking up on the themes in these songs as they come up. There's a lot, of course, of music hall songs. The Seaside Girls is a song that's linked with Blazes Boylan, just because it's kind of a profane song. So it sort of sums up Boylan as a figure. And so Joyce brings kind of high and low traditions together. But I think he was just inveterately interested in music and opera. He avidly went to opera in Trieste, in Paris, during a stay in London in 1931. He went almost every night to Covent Garden. So he saw it as, and Giorgio, his son, becomes an opera singer. So it's essential for him. I think it taps into things that can't be expressed in any other way. I think we all have that sense. It's very hard to describe music. Joyce tries to become music, to write in a musical style in Sirens, but words can only get so far along the road. But music brings people together in a way that poetry does as well, because it's tapping into something that you can't, something profound that you can't express in any other way. And it needn't just be profound. You have music that's anarchic, like punk rock or rap or something like that, that's acting up emotions, but that words are not going to be enough. Music, of course, is often accompanied by words. So it's an expressive side of the human that Joyce is absolutely fascinated by. He could have been a professional singer himself anyway. So in a way, he's kind of dabbling in a trade, a profession that never became his, and he's folding it into Ulysses. But it's crucial for sure.
And the novel is full of sounds. Not
Yes,
only do you have music,
that's right.
but he uses words for a sound, from the creak of a door to the tap, tap, tap of the blind man, which
that's
is
very true. Yeah.
Really
And some of that is modern, just being in a city, because probably we're all sitting in different rooms and places, and I'm hearing someone's lawnmower out there and things like, there are always these extraneous sounds in a city that you can't block out. But everything speaks in Ulysses. Even abstract things can speak. When you get to Circe, they all have kind of voices and roles, and it's kind of part of what Joyce is doing. There is this submerged population in Dublin that's kind of politically powerless, doesn't really have a future. There are all these people just wandering the streets of Dublin, seemingly without work or jobs or a future or any kind of inkling what they can do or what even the next day will bring. And he's giving a voice to all of this.
One other
Go ahead.
question. I know this, I don't think anybody wrote this in, but we had this question during our 8-10 months together. Another thing we trace, UP up.
Yes.
And what does that mean? Is Mary there laughing? That we have a cardiologist was in our group, a doctor.
All right.
And he had this theory, what we bandied about different theories, why Mr. Breen was so insulted. And our Dr. Hal Card said that there is a medical condition where the urethra is on top of the penis. And so when the man urinates, he urinates up. And so he wondered if, knowing Joyce is very interested in bodily functions all throughout the novel and in science, that could he have been thinking about that as well, which is another reason Mr. Breen would be very insulted.
It would take Albany to come up with that kind of a
theory. I said
it's interesting, and then when you think about Bloom and Stephen urinating together at the end of Ithaca, it's quite feasible. I haven't heard that explanation before, because there are various suppositions, and I think it was kind of a famous insult bandied about in kind of parlance in that era, which now it's kind of dropped out of language, and in the meantime, also people kind of see it as yippee, just up yours, or that it just sounds that it could even be nonsense, but that it, and equally another kind of irritating puzzle that a bit like the man in the Mac, and that it destabilizes Brian, who's unstable anyway.
Right. I did say we all said Hal should write an article about this. And a question Kate Burgess also asked, and is, who is your favorite character? Maybe taking away Bloom, Stephen, and Molly.
Oh, yeah, then I really would have to think. Yeah. Some of the minor figures maybe in Cersei, like Mrs. Yelverton Barry, who go after Bloom, barmaids in Sirens. Um, yeah, I think I more regularly would have said Molly Bloom. I like Gertie MacDowell as well. I'm interested in her as a figure. Um, like the female characters are very marginalized, I think, anyway, in Ulysses. It's kind of part of the conundrum, that you have some they couldn't be central given the kind of society, I guess, that Joyce is depicting, even though Virginia Woolf in the same era is trying to redress that sort of balance in the novel. And Joyce certainly has pivotal female figures in all of his texts when you think about the dead and Olivia in Finnegan's Wake and Molly and Ulysses, but they're both central and in a typical female position as well, and stereotypical often as well. So that's why I think I gravitate towards a lot of the female figures like Yelverton Barry or Josie Breen and so on.
Good. We had Dr. Lindsay Erner Byrne on at the start of the month, and she was talking about poverty in Ireland, and it was absolutely fascinating. The interplay between these very poor people living in tenements in Dublin, writing to the Archbishop and looking for money. And so, can you speak a little bit about poverty and charity and how it's portrayed, or what Joyce, does he comment on it?
Yeah, you get a sense of some of the poverty in Ulysses. I mean, Joyce doesn't gravitate towards the tenements to the degree, say, that Shona Casey does, who also didn't grow up in tenements. It's partly because Joyce's own milieu is more lower middle class and then lower middle class. So he comes from a wealthier background. By and large, Ulysses centers on the lower middle class, and it ignores kind of the grand squares as well, like Merrion Square. So he kind of brings us on a middle route to Dublin. But the poverty certainly impinges. It's very clear in the way that he writes about food constantly in a way that most Irish writers didn't. And some people see that almost, it's an aspect certainly of Joyce's realism, but that also a kind of legacy of the famine, which is not that far in the past. So food plays a huge role. And Dublin was, he calls it dirty Dublin, a destitute society in the era. The original Joyceans who first visited 7 Eccles Street noted that still was a tenement up to, I think they would have been talking about the 1960s. There were still whole families living in single rooms in Eccles Street. And it's partly why the Georgian buildings, alas, got pulled down, because in people's heads in Dublin, they were very much associated first with the ascendancy and then with this terrible decline in Dublin in the period, where there were no inside toilets, no running water, disease, poverty, and misery. So Joyce, I suppose, to a degree, papers over some of that, but it's always there. You see it in lots of little details and creeping into the picture. So even if you take the Dignam family, what's going to happen to them now that the father, who was an alcoholic anyway, has died, and they're living in Sandymount, which is quite a grand part of Dublin, but they're going to have no income. It's kind of clear that family will be broken up, and they are going to fall on hard times. The Blooms are relatively well off. Those houses on Eccles Street are big houses, but they have a plan to rent out some of the rooms because they don't have a huge stream of income.
Yeah, it's
interesting. We worry about the Dedalus family too.
Yeah. Oh no, completely. Yeah, and Joyce would have experienced that himself. Because people were malnourished, and people lived off just bread and dripping, potatoes sometimes. That the diet was very narrow and impoverished. Joyce himself and Nora loved to eat. I mean, their letters are full of descriptions of food and eating. They ate out a lot, but they seem to have really relished the opportunity as adults to enjoy food in a way perhaps they couldn't when they were younger.
So thank you so much, Dr. Fogarty and Dr. Lasch Carroll. I think this was amazing. You know, they'll have to start reading the book again, I think, now and get all these second insights. Did you have any last questions, Meg, or comments there?
I guess, and I hope it's not too big of a question, but back to that word aspirational. You know, we see the novel certainly as realistic in some ways, Joyce using realism. How is it aspirational? Joyce is writing this in 1922 about 1924, and you yourself said in a webinar that he's putting things in 1904 that didn't exist in 1904.
Yeah.
So what are some of those aspirational hopes or for Ireland or for Dublin?
That Joyce is writing in the shadow and kind of impelled by the whole revolutionary period, the literary revival, but also all of the kind of social revolution that happens in Ireland, that revolutionary generation that Joyce belonged to. They were his college mates in UCD who wanted to gain Irish independence, but also transform Irish society. It was happening on every level. The cooperative movement, building up the creameries and building up local industry in Ireland. And Joyce, as the artist, wants to create a kind of radical blueprint for a kind of Irish future, feeding off the Irish past, but everything about Ireland that's unique and different, Irish language, not the Irish language itself, Gaelic as it's called in the States. People in Ireland always say Irish when they're referring to Gaelic. Joyce himself doesn't seem to have liked the Irish language much, but he had an absolute ear for Irish idiom, turns of phrase in Ireland, which are completely unique. So he wants to capture all of these chaotic energies of Ireland, not to put it down on the page and bring it to full stop, but as I think, to kind of project it into a future where it'll live on, recreated all the time by readers who re-encounter the text. And the first readers that he really wanted were readers in Ireland, because he wanted to see them, he says in Dubliners, you know, to see themselves in his nicely polished looking glass. And Ulysses is another kind of looking glass, which looks to a future. And he gives you the dates of composition of the text at the end. So you're aware this is Irish art, kind of boldly going forward, confidently into a future.
Wonderful.
Well, you know, thank you again so much. I'm sure everyone on today, the 16th, we're going to be reading later on tonight some extracts from Ulysses up at Celtic Hall and New Carner Road. So look forward to that. And of course, Dublin, they're probably all out in their boaters and Victorian skirts and everything all day doing different readings. Our next event here at the museum is a Zoom event with Emma de Souza, who's a human rights campaigner, and she'll talk to us about a post-Brexit Northern Ireland.
Oh, so, wonderful.
Yeah, we have a program in June.
Yes, yes.
But thank you very much, all of the reading group, for saying thank you. And thank you, Dr. Lasch Carroll, for moderating. I think it was absolutely fascinating. And this will be available on our YouTube channel, because I'm sure it'll be a resource for people for years to come. They're all giving you claps.
Thank you, Anne. This was such a special event.
It was, it really was.
Thank you too. Thank you for all the great questions.
Great. And I'm sure we'll have you back about other things. But thank you very much. I'm a UCD alum, so I'm always watching you. But thank you very much and take care. Enjoy the rest of Bloomsday, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.